What is the scariest story you know that is 100% true? I would call it creepy more than scary, but my mom's friend had a small house and lived alone. She noticed weird things, a batch of soup depleting faster than usual, missing eggs, damp towels in the hamper when she hadn't used any, extra dishes in the dishwasher, etc. This went on for months. She thought she was just being forgetful. One day she heard some thumping around in her attic and went to investigate. She found some makeshift living quarters, small radio, hot plate, sleeping bag, pillow, food wrappers, etc. She called the cops who came to keep an eye on the place. They ended up catching a homeless man climbing a tree, trying to sneak into her attic window. He had been doing this almost daily. He would wait for her to go to work, then go downstairs and help himself to food and amenities. The funny part about this story is they got to know each other throughout the ordeal, and the guy was actually very respectful, just down on his luck. She didn't press charges, instead, let him move in, helped him get a job, and he lived in the attic until he got back on his feet. Creepy shit with a happy ending. The 1904 Cincinnati Privy disaster. In 1904, 9 schoolgirls drowned in an outhouse after the floor collapsed. They literally drowned in human waste. My friend's boss bought an Audi A4 convertible back when they were new and interesting. One of the talking points was the pop-up roll hoops that were hidden unless you rolled it. A few months after buying it, he got to test those roll hoops out as he lost control and skidded down a steep bank about 10 meters, 35 feet, deep. The roll hoops did their job, and he survived with just cuts and scratches from the bushes he plowed through. The car ended up the right way up, and he got out, walked back up the bank to the side of the road, then got on the phone to the police to report the accident. While he was standing there, a driver from a car that had seen the accident came over to speak to him. Approaching from behind, the other driver asked if he was okay. My friend's boss turned around to reply and dropped dead. His neck had been fractured, but was in one piece right up until he turned his head when it severed his spinal cord. Not as scary as some of the stories here, but I was pretty horrified when my dad told me the story. There are some really big houses in the woods in my hometown. One of the owners went out drinking with his buddies and realized he forgot the key to the gate when he got home. So he decided to just climb the gate. While climbing in his drunken state, he slips and his leg gets pierced by one of the spikes on the gate. He was hanging there but too afraid to call for his wife, since he was sure she would just open the automatic gate from inside the house, and since it was one of those gates that slides to the side, it would just rip his leg off if she did. He was hanging there the entire night until his wife woke up, saw him and called the fire department. My dad, who is one of the firefighters that showed up, said they had to saw off the spike to get him off. Just imagine hanging from your own gate all night not being able to call for help. This is a hometown story that stayed with me. It happened literally right around the corner from where I grew up, maybe a 2-minute drive away. Judy Kirby murdered 6 children and 1 adult by intentionally driving the wrong way on a divided highway in an attempt to commit suicide. She had been hospitalized for depression, but had also just ended a relationship with her ex-husband's brother and was, by some reports, involved in drug trafficking and fearing an imminent arrest. She picked up her sister's son, who was celebrating his 10th birthday that day. She then loaded her 3 children into the car, supposedly to pick up a gift for the nephew. Instead, she went missing with the carload of kids. A short time later, calls started coming into 911 about a car going the wrong way down the highway at a high rate of speed. They made it about 90 seconds before a head-on collision with another vehicle, driven by a father with 2 children and another child along for the ride. The crash annihilated both vehicles. The only survivors were Kirby herself and the child who was along for the ride in the other car. There were pieces of children all over the highway. She was sentenced to 215 years in prison. My dad and some friends got drunk and went for a drive on some back roads and were going as fast as the truck would go as teenagers. My dad was slightly less drunk than the others and eventually demanded they let him get out. They pulled over, and he and one other girl got out. He and the girl started walking to town, while the other three sped off in the opposite direction. Well, less than a mile up the road from where they got out is an extremely sharp turn, which they missed, and hit a tree going pretty close to triple digits miles per hour. Two of them died on impact, and the only reason the third survived is because they crashed in front of a house that 2 doctors lived in. The survivor was paralyzed and lost his leg and part of his arm, and was in the hospital for 8 months before dying. This was in the '60s, so medical care wasn't what it is today. When I first got my permit, my dad took me to that corner to explain the importance of safe driving. It gave me goosebumps about how close he was to being in the truck. He said that the dad of the driver got what remained of the truck to be hung up in the center of town for months after, to be a warning to all. A woman named Joyce Vincent died alone in her bedsit/apartment in London and wasn't found for 2 years. She was only discovered because bailiffs came to evict her from the property and instead found her decomposed body in half skeleton form. The TV had been on and the windows had been open for 2 years. Despite the smell and the noise emanating from the apartment, no one had come sooner and found her. Because of the state her body was found in, they could only identify her through matching her teeth to a photograph of her smiling. Because there was basically no body left to study, no one knows how she passed. Her friends guess it was anything from murder to an asthma attack, but no one can ever know. It's not the most scary story in terms of its gruesomeness. Some tales in this thread have made me nauseous, but to think someone can die alone and not be found by their family or friends for so long, especially in such a densely populated city, terrifies me. It's the spring of 2001. I was just ending my shift at a major hospital in New York. I headed back to my apartment, entertained my daughter with random conversation for a while, had a meal, and was chilling out. Business as usual. Later that night, my mother came by and took me back to the very same hospital where I worked. We were conversing in the car, and nothing seemed out of sorts at all. She never mentioned where we were headed, and I had no idea of the destination until we actually arrived. When we arrived at the hospital, I kept getting questioned about who I was, including who I really was, where I grew up, who my daughter was, where I lived, and more. Battery after battery of third degree, coming out of absolutely nowhere. I had no clue what was going on, or why anyone was interrogating me this way. Fast forward to about 3 days later or so. I find myself sitting in a chair, calmly looking out at a lovely view from my apartment window. Except this wasn't my apartment. In a quiet panic, I took stock of my surroundings and realized I was at the end of a hallway and I'd been here before. It was the hospital where I worked, but it wasn't in New York. It was Portland, and it was the psych floor. In an instant, I had no idea why I was there, what day or time it was, nor what had gone on since my last shift on the floors beneath. It turns out that I was, indeed, working a regular shift several days prior. The story is that I walked off the job with no warning nor explanation, went to my mother's place, and was rambling on about what I needed to do in the city the next day. She took me to the where I reported living in New York City, complete with some bogus address and phone number. With my daughter, I was claiming that my little sister was my daughter. They admitted me, and I didn't break back into generally accepted reality for several days. When I came to, as described above, I had absolutely no idea what had happened, why I was locked up again, nor any memory whatsoever of what I'd said or done after that instant walking off of my shift. Statistically, probably no one reading this has been blessed with the misfortune of dissociative fugue. Sitting in that chair by the window at the end of a hospital hallway, when literally one instant earlier I'd been casually going about my job, felt just as disorienting and jarring as you'd imagine. I know this isn't a serial killer or drunk driver story, but it's absolutely true, and it's the single most terrifying event of my life. I wouldn't wish that instant reality shift sensation on my very worst enemy. Psychosis is a hell of a drug.
I'm gay.